Imagine dedicating your entire life to saving others, risking everything for strangers you'll never meet again, only to watch as the world moves on without a single acknowledgement of your sacrifice. Picture being the person everyone calls when disaster strikes, yet remaining invisible when the cameras roll and the medals are handed out. This is the reality that thousands of unsung heroes face every day, brilliant, courageous individuals whose extraordinary acts of bravery disappear into the shadows of bureaucracy and oversight. But what happens when the most powerful person in the nation finally notices? What unfolds when a king decides that silence is no longer acceptable? This is the remarkable true story of a hero whose decades of service went unrecognized until one unexpected phone call changed everything. It's a tale that will make you question how many extraordinary people walk among us unnoticed, and it will restore your faith in the power of recognition to transform not just one life, but an entire community's understanding of what true heroism looks like. Prepare yourself for a journey that begins in the most ordinary of places and ends in the most extraordinary of ceremonies, proving that sometimes the greatest victories come not from the battles we fight, but from finally being seen for who we truly are. Margaret Thompson had never intended to become a hero. At 62, she still remembered the young woman who had simply wanted to help people, the fresh-faced graduate who had joined the Mountain Rescue Service 38 years ago with nothing more than a desire to make a difference. She never could have imagined that her name would one day be spoken in the same breath as legends, or that her story would become the kind that parents tell their children about courage and perseverance. The alarm pierced through the quiet of her cottage at 4 in the morning, just as it had thousands of times before. Margaret's eyes snapped open instantly, her body already moving before her mind had fully processed the sound. After nearly 4 decades of emergency calls, her response had become as automatic as breathing. She was dressed and out the door in under 3 minutes, her rescue pack already loaded in the back of her Land Rover. The voice on the radio was tense, but controlled. A family of 4 had gone missing during a hiking expedition in the Cairngorms. The weather had turned brutal overnight, with snow falling heavily and visibility dropping to nearly zero. The temperature had plummeted to minus 15 degrees Celsius, and the wind was howling at 60 miles per hour. These were the conditions that separated the experience from the reckless, and unfortunately, it appeared this family had fallen into the latter category. Margaret drove through the darkness, her headlights cutting through the swirling snow as she made her way to the base camp. She had been the lead coordinator for mountain rescues in this region for over 20 years, and she knew these mountains better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. Every peak, every valley, every dangerous outcrop was mapped in her mind with the precision of someone whose life's work depended on such knowledge. When she arrived at the coordination center, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The missing family consisted of parents in their 30s and 2 children, ages 8 and 12. They had been reported missing by the father's brother, who had been expecting them to return to their holiday cottage by 10 the previous evening. When they failed to arrive, and when their mobile phones went straight to voicemail, he had contacted the authorities. The rescue team that assembled that morning was impressive by any standard. 15 volunteers, all experienced climbers and rescue specialists, had responded to the call. They came from various backgrounds: teachers, mechanics, doctors, shop owners, but they all shared the same commitment to saving lives in the mountains they loved. Margaret had trained most of them personally, and she knew their capabilities as well as she knew her own. The search area was vast and treacherous. The family's last known position was near Ben Macdui, the second highest peak in Scotland, but the storm could have blown them off course by miles. The snow was still falling, covering any tracks they might have left, and the wind made helicopter support impossible. This would be a ground operation, requiring teams to fan out across dangerous terrain in conditions that would challenge even the most experienced mountaineers. Margaret divided the volunteers into 4 teams, each responsible for covering a specific sector of the search area. She would lead one team herself, focusing on the most likely routes the family might have taken based on the weather patterns and the terrain. Her team consisted of 3 other volunteers. James, a local doctor who had been volunteering for rescue operations for 15 years. Sarah, a professional climbing instructor who knew the technical aspects of mountain rescue better than anyone. And David, a retired police officer whose methodical approach had helped locate dozens of missing people over the years. The ascent began in darkness, with only their headlamps providing light as they navigated the increasingly treacherous path. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the wind threatened to knock them off balance with every gust. Margaret set a steady pace, knowing that they needed to cover ground quickly while still maintaining safety protocols. Every decision she made could mean the difference between finding the family alive or not finding them at all. As dawn broke, the full scope of the challenge became clear. The landscape was transformed into an alien world of white, where familiar landmarks had disappeared under blankets of snow. The visibility remained poor, with the storm showing no signs of abating. Margaret consulted her GPS regularly, but she relied more on her intimate knowledge of the terrain and her ability to read the subtle signs that indicated direction and elevation. 3 hours into the search, Sarah spotted something that made her heart race. A flash of bright orange fabric was barely visible beneath the accumulation of snow near a rocky outcrop about 200 meters off their planned route. Margaret immediately redirected the team, her pulse quickening as they approached what could be their first real lead. The orange fabric turned out to be a child's jacket, partially buried but unmistakably fresh. More importantly, it suggested that the family had indeed passed through this area, and recently enough that the storm hadn't completely covered their traces. Margaret immediately radioed the discovery to the other teams and the coordination center, providing precise GPS coordinates and requesting that all teams adjust their search patterns to focus on this new area of interest. The discovery energized the entire rescue operation. Would have been a needle in a haystack search suddenly had focus and direction. Margaret's team began following what appeared to be a faint trail, marked not by footprints but by subtle disturbances in the snow and the occasional piece of debris that suggested human passage. It required the kind of tracking skills that come only from years of experience and an almost supernatural ability to read the landscape. The trail led them down into a valley that Margaret knew well, a place where inexperienced hikers often became disoriented because of the way the terrain folded back on itself. It was also a place where people seeking shelter from storms would naturally gravitate, as it offered some protection from the wind and several rocky overhangs that could provide temporary refuge. As they descended into the valley, Margaret felt the familiar mixture of hope and dread that came with every rescue operation. Hope because they were clearly on the right track, and dread because they still had no idea what condition the family might be in. Exposure to the extreme cold could be fatal within hours, and the family had been missing for over 12 hours already. The breakthrough came when James spotted movement near a cluster of large boulders at the bottom of the valley. Through the swirling snow, they could make out what appeared to be a makeshift shelter constructed from branches and covered with a tarp. More importantly, they could see signs of recent activity and what looked like a small fire that had been recently extinguished. Margaret approached the shelter carefully, calling out to identify herself and the rescue team. The response was immediate and overwhelming, voices calling back from inside the shelter, including the high-pitched voices of children. The family was alive, conscious, and responsive. It was the moment that made all the cold, the danger, and the exhaustion worthwhile. The rescue itself required careful coordination and technical skill. The family was suffering from various degrees of hypothermia and exhaustion, but they were mobile and coherent. The father had injured his ankle during the night, which had slowed their progress and contributed to their becoming lost, but it wasn't a life-threatening injury. Margaret and her team worked efficiently to assess their condition, provide emergency medical care, and prepare them for the journey back to safety. The evacuation took 4 hours, with the rescue team essentially carrying 2 of the family members and supporting the others as they navigated back up the valley and out to where vehicles could reach them. Margaret coordinated every step of the process, making constant decisions about route selection, rest periods, and medical priorities. Her experience showed in every detail, from the way she managed the team's energy to her ability to keep the rescued family calm and focused during the difficult journey. By the time they reached the road, news crews were waiting. The successful rescue of a family with young children in such extreme conditions was exactly the kind of story that captured public attention. As the family was loaded into ambulances for transport to the hospital, reporters pushed forward with cameras and microphones, eager to capture the drama of the moment. But Margaret was already walking away, her job done. She had no interest in the media attention that surrounded successful rescues. Her satisfaction came from the knowledge that 4 people who had been in mortal danger were now safe, that 2 children would be going home to continue their lives instead of becoming statistics. That was enough for her, as it had been enough for nearly 4 decades of similar rescues. The local newspaper ran a small story about the rescue the following week, mentioning Margaret's role in passing, but focusing more on the dramatic elements of the story and the gratitude of the rescued family. It was typical of how such events were covered. The human interest angle was emphasized while the professional expertise that made the rescue possible was taken for granted. What the newspaper didn't mention was that this rescue was Margaret's 437th successful mission. It didn't mention that she had never lost a person under her command, or that she had personally saved the lives of over 800 people during her career. It didn't mention that she had received no salary for this work, that she had funded much of her own equipment, or that she had missed countless family gatherings and personal milestones to respond to emergency calls. The article also didn't mention that Margaret had been recommended for official recognition 7 times over the previous 2 decades, only to see those recommendations disappear into bureaucratic processes that seemed designed to lose rather than process such nominations. Her colleagues knew her value. The family she had saved understood her importance, but somehow that knowledge never translated into the kind of official acknowledgement that her service deserved. Margaret returned home that evening to her quiet cottage, where she cleaned and restocked her rescue equipment, checked the weather forecast for the following day, and prepared for whatever emergency might arise next. She had no way of knowing that her name had finally reached someone who had the power to change everything, or that her decades of invisible service were about to become visible in ways she had never imagined. The call would come 3 weeks later, on an ordinary Tuesday morning when she was tending her small garden behind the cottage. When the phone rang, she almost didn't answer it, thinking it was probably another charity solicitation or a wrong number. But something made her wipe her hands on her gardening apron and pick up the receiver, a decision that would transform her life in ways she could never have anticipated. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and slightly formal in a way that immediately caught her attention. It was someone from Buckingham Palace, calling to inform her that His Majesty King Charles III had personally requested a meeting to discuss her service to the nation. The caller explained that the king had become aware of her extraordinary record of service and wanted to meet with her personally before making an announcement that would honor her contributions. Margaret stood in her kitchen, still holding the phone, trying to process what she had just heard. After 40 years of service, after hundreds of rescues, after decades of being overlooked by the official recognition systems, the king himself had taken notice. It seemed impossible, like something that happened to other people in stories she read about in newspapers. But the caller was patiently waiting for her response, and eventually Margaret found her voice enough to accept the invitation. A meeting was scheduled for the following week at a location that would be disclosed closer to the date. As she hung up the phone, Margaret realized that her life as an invisible guardian was about to end, and her new life as a recognized hero was about to begin. The week leading up to the meeting passed in a blur of nervous anticipation and surreal phone calls. Margaret found herself questioning whether the entire situation was real or some elaborate mistake. She had lived her entire adult life in the shadows of recognition, content to do her work without fanfare or official acknowledgement. The idea that the King of England knew her name and wanted to meet with her personally seemed to belong to someone else's story. The second phone call came on Friday, providing details about the meeting location and protocol. Margaret would be met at Edinburgh Waverley Station by a royal protection officer who would escort her to Holyrood Palace, where King Charles would receive her in his private study. The formality of the arrangements only added to her sense of unreality. She had rescued hundreds of people from mountains, cliffs, and ravines, but the prospect of meeting the monarch made her more nervous than any rescue operation she had ever undertaken. Margaret spent the weekend attempting to prepare for an experience that seemed to have no precedent in her life. She pressed her best dress, a simple navy blue outfit that she had worn to her daughter's wedding 3 years earlier. She practiced walking in the low heels that had been sitting and used in her wardrobe since that same wedding. Most challenging of all, she tried to imagine what she might say to the king when they met. The journey to Edinburgh on Monday morning felt like traveling to another world. Margaret had made the same train journey hundreds of times over the years, usually heading to equipment suppliers or training courses related to her rescue work. But this time, she found herself looking out the window at the familiar Scottish landscape and wondering how her life had suddenly become so extraordinary. At Waverley Station, the Royal Protection Officer was exactly what Margaret had expected: professional, courteous, and efficiently discreet. He introduced himself simply as Inspector Morrison and led her to a waiting car without drawing any attention from the busy commuters surrounding them. The drive through Edinburgh's historic streets gave Margaret time to collect her thoughts and try to calm her nerves. Holyrood Palace was even more impressive than she had imagined. As they passed through the security checkpoints and walked through corridors lined with portraits of Scottish royalty, Margaret felt the weight of history surrounding her. She was a practical woman who had spent her life focused on immediate, concrete problems, but even she couldn't ignore the significance of being invited into this seat of royal power. The private study where she waited for the king was surprisingly comfortable and unpretentious. Books lined the walls, and the furniture looked well used rather than merely decorative. A large window overlooked the palace gardens, where Margaret could see gardeners working among flower beds that were just beginning to show their spring colors. The normalcy of the scene helped calm her nerves slightly. When King Charles entered the room, Margaret was struck by how different he seemed from his public appearances. In person, he appeared more relaxed, more genuinely interested in connecting with another human being rather than performing royal duties. He shook her hand warmly and immediately put her at ease with his direct, unpretentious manner of speaking. The king began the conversation by explaining how he had learned about Margaret's service. A detailed report about outstanding civilian contributions to public safety had crossed his desk during his regular review of honors and recognition recommendations. Margaret's name had appeared not once, but multiple times, with testimonials from fellow rescue workers, local officials, and family she had helped spanning nearly 2 decades. What had caught the king's attention was not just the number of lives Margaret had saved, but the consistent pattern of her being overlooked for official recognition despite repeated recommendations from her colleagues. The bureaucratic failures that had kept her contributions invisible had actually worked in her favor, creating a documented trail of evidence that made her case for recognition undeniable. King Charles spoke passionately about his belief that public service should be recognized regardless of whether it takes place in uniform or as a volunteer. He had been following the stories of civilian heroes throughout his reign, and Margaret's record of service represented exactly the kind of selfless dedication that he felt deserved the highest levels of royal recognition. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Margaret had expected. Rather than a formal ceremony or brief presentation, the king engaged her in a detailed discussion about mountain rescue work, the challenges facing volunteer services, and her experiences over nearly 4 decades of emergency response. He asked thoughtful questions about rescue techniques, equipment needs, and the psychological challenges of repeatedly facing life and death situations. Margaret found herself relaxing as she talked about the work that had defined her life. She described the technical aspects of mountain rescue, the importance of teamwork and training, and the satisfaction that came from successfully bringing people home to their families. The king listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification or expressing genuine amazement at the physical and emotional demands of her work. As their conversation continued, Margaret began to understand that this meeting was about more than simply recognizing her individual service. King Charles was clearly concerned about the broader issue of how society recognizes and supports the people who dedicate themselves to helping others without expectation of reward or recognition. Her story had become a symbol of a larger problem that he was determined to address. The king explained that he wanted to create a new category of royal recognition specifically designed to honor civilian heroes who had been overlooked by traditional systems. Margaret would be the first recipient of this new honor, but the real goal was to establish a precedent that would ensure other deserving individuals would not be forgotten in the future. The honor itself was to be called the Royal Medal for Exceptional Civilian Service, and it would carry the same weight and recognition as military honors for equivalent service. The medal would be presented at a public ceremony attended by senior members of the royal family, government officials, and representatives from the emergency services community. Margaret's ceremony would take place at Windsor Castle in 6 weeks, giving time for proper planning and media coverage. Margaret was overwhelmed by the scope of what the king was proposing. The idea of a public ceremony, media attention, and formal recognition was far removed from her comfort zone. She had spent 40 years working in the background, and the prospect of suddenly being thrust into the spotlight was daunting. But she also understood that accepting this honor was about more than her personal preferences. The king seemed to sense her discomfort with the public attention aspect of the recognition. He assured her that the ceremony would be conducted with dignity and focus on the importance of public service rather than treating her as a celebrity. The goal was to inspire others to consider how they might contribute to their communities while ensuring that future heroes would not be overlooked as she had been. As their meeting drew to a close, King Charles asked Margaret about her family and her plans for the future. She told him about her daughter, who worked as a teacher in Glasgow, and her 2 grandchildren who were just beginning to understand what their grandmother did in the mountains. She admitted that she had been thinking about reducing her active rescue work in the coming years, though she planned to continue training new volunteers and sharing her expertise. The king expressed his hope that her recognition would encourage her to continue her service in whatever capacity felt appropriate. He also suggested that her experience and knowledge could be valuable in developing training programs and safety protocols that could benefit rescue services throughout the country. The idea of transitioning from active rescue work to a more educational and advisory role appealed to Margaret immensely. Before she left the palace, King Charles took Margaret on a brief tour of the state apartments, sharing stories about the history of the building and its role in Scottish royal history. It was a gesture that went far beyond the requirements of their official meeting, and it demonstrated the genuine respect and admiration he felt for her service. The ride back to the train station passed in contemplative silence. Margaret found herself trying to process not just what had happened, but what it meant for her future. After decades of being invisible, she was about to become very visible indeed. The prospect was both exciting and terrifying, but she knew that she could not turn away from this opportunity to represent all the unsung heroes who worked tirelessly to help others. The journey home gave her time to think about how she would tell her daughter about the day's events. Sarah had always been proud of her mother's work, but she had also been frustrated by the lack of recognition Margaret had received over the years. The news that the king himself had taken notice would be vindication for all the family events Margaret had missed and all the nights they had worried about her safety in the mountains. Margaret called her daughter from the train, struggling to find words that could adequately describe what had happened. Sarah's reaction was immediate and emotional. She cried with joy and pride, then immediately began planning how the entire family could attend the ceremony at Windsor Castle. It was a response that helped Margaret understand how much her lack of recognition had affected not just her, but everyone who loved her. That evening, as Margaret sat in her cottage reviewing the official documents that had been provided about the ceremony and the new medal, she felt a profound sense of completion. Not because her rescue work was ending, but because 40 years of service were finally being acknowledged in a way that honored not just her individual contributions, but the value of civilian service to society. The phone rang again that night, and this time it was the local newspaper wanting to interview her about the upcoming ceremony. Word had apparently leaked about the royal recognition, and media interest was already building. Margaret agreed to speak with the reporter, understanding that publicity was now part of her responsibility as the first recipient of the new honor. The newspaper interview was the first of many that would follow in the coming weeks. Margaret found herself telling her story over and over, each time trying to emphasize the importance of teamwork in rescue operations and the dedication of all the volunteers who had worked with her over the years. She was determined to use the attention to highlight the broader community of people who dedicate themselves to helping others. As word of her recognition spread through the mountain rescue community, Margaret began receiving calls and messages from colleagues, friends, and even people she had rescued over the years. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with many people expressing their joy that her service was finally being acknowledged at the highest levels. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from the current generation of rescue volunteers, who saw Margaret's recognition as validation of their own commitment to helping others. Young climbers and hikers who had joined rescue services inspired by stories of her work felt a new sense of pride in their volunteer service, knowing that society was beginning to recognize the value of what they did. The 6 weeks leading up to the ceremony would prove to be a whirlwind of preparation, interviews, and planning. But for Margaret, the most important work had already been done in that quiet study at Holyrood Palace, where a king had taken the time to truly understand the value of a life spent in service to others. Everything that followed would be ceremony and celebration, but the real recognition had already taken place in that private conversation between two people who understood the importance of serving something larger than themselves. The transformation in Margaret's life was immediate and overwhelming. Within 48 hours of the palace meeting, her quiet cottage had become the center of a media storm that she could never have anticipated. News vans lined the narrow road leading to her home, reporters camped outside her garden gate, and her phone rang constantly with requests for interviews, photographs, and personal appearances. The story that emerged in the press was everything Margaret had hoped to avoid throughout her career. Headlines screamed about the mountain angel and the invisible hero finally seen. Television news programs led with dramatic reenactments of her rescues, complete with helicopter footage of the treacherous terrain where she had saved hundreds of lives. The narrative that developed focused on the romance and drama of her work rather than the technical expertise and systematic approach that actually made her effective. Margaret's daughter Sarah arrived from Glasgow the day after the story broke, taking leave from her teaching position to help her mother navigate the sudden attention. She found Margaret sitting at her kitchen table, staring at a stack of interview requests and looking overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening to her previously private life. Sarah had always been protective of her mother, and she immediately took charge of managing the media requests. She established a daily schedule that limited interviews to specific times and locations, ensuring that Margaret had time to process what was happening and maintain some semblance of normal life. More importantly, Sarah helped her mother understand that this attention, while uncomfortable, was an opportunity to advocate for causes and people that had been important to her throughout her career. The first major television interview was scheduled for the following week with BBC Scotland. Margaret spent days preparing, not because she didn't know her own story, but because she wanted to ensure that the conversation focused on the broader issues of volunteer service, emergency preparedness, and the need to support civilian rescue operations. She was determined not to let the interview become simply a celebration of her individual achievements. The BBC interview took place in Margaret's cottage, with cameras capturing the modest home where she had lived throughout her rescue career. The interviewer, a seasoned journalist named James McLeod, had done his research thoroughly and asked thoughtful questions about the technical aspects of mountain rescue, the psychological challenges of the work, and Margaret's thoughts about being overlooked for so many years. Margaret's performance during the interview surprised even her daughter. Despite her nervousness about being on television, she spoke with the same calm authority that had characterized her rescue operations. She described the importance of training, the value of teamwork, and the satisfaction that came from successfully completing difficult rescues. Most importantly, she used the platform to acknowledge the contributions of her fellow volunteers and to advocate for better funding and support for civilian rescue services. The interview was broadcast on a Sunday evening and reached an audience of over 2 million viewers across Scotland and Northern England. The response was immediate and powerful, with viewers calling the television station to share their own stories of rescue services and to express their admiration for Margaret's work. The BBC received more positive feedback about this single interview than they typically receive for entire months of programming. But the media attention also brought challenges that Margaret had not anticipated. Reporters began investigating her personal life, looking for dramatic angles or controversial elements that could add excitement to their stories. They interviewed former colleagues, neighbors, and even people she had rescued, sometimes taking statements out of context or emphasizing details that Margaret felt were private or irrelevant to her professional service. The most difficult moment came when a tabloid newspaper published a story about Margaret's personal sacrifices, focusing on her divorced marriage and a strained relationship with her ex-husband. The article suggested that her dedication to rescue work had destroyed her family relationships, painting her as someone who had chosen heroic service over personal happiness. The story was filled with speculation and unnamed sources, and it presented a version of her life that felt both invasive and inaccurate. Margaret was devastated by the tabloid coverage, not because it revealed anything particularly damaging, but because it reduced her complex life and career to a simplistic narrative about personal sacrifice. The article ignored the fact that her marriage had ended for reasons completely unrelated to her rescue work, and it failed to mention the strong relationship she maintained with her daughter and grandchildren. Sarah was furious about the tabloid story and wanted to pursue legal action against the newspaper for invasion of privacy. But Margaret, after consultation with the Palace Communications Office, decided to address the issue directly through a carefully crafted public statement. She acknowledged that her rescue work had required significant time and commitment, but she emphasized that it had also enriched her life immeasurably and provided her with a sense of purpose that sustained her through difficult times. The statement was released through the palace's official channels, giving it additional weight and authority. Margaret explained that while her career had indeed required sacrifices, those sacrifices had been freely chosen and had never diminished her love for her family or her commitment to her personal relationships. She also pointed out that thousands of volunteer rescue workers managed to balance their service with full family lives, and that the demands of rescue work were no different from the demands faced by doctors, firefighters, or police officers. The response to Margaret's statement was overwhelmingly positive. Editorial writers praised her dignity in the face of intrusive coverage, and other rescue workers came forward to share their own experiences of balancing service with family life. The tabloid story, which had initially seemed damaging, actually strengthened public support for Margaret and increased awareness of the challenges faced by volunteer emergency workers. As the weeks passed, Margaret began to adapt to her new public role in ways that surprised both her and her family. She accepted invitations to speak at rescue training conferences, appeared at fundraising events for mountain rescue organizations, and began working with government officials to develop new policies supporting civilian emergency services. The recognition from King Charles had opened doors that allowed her to influence the future of rescue services in ways that went far beyond her individual contributions. The most meaningful development was Margaret's involvement in establishing new training standards for civilian rescue operations. Her decades of experience had given her insights into effective rescue techniques, safety protocols, and team management that could benefit rescue services throughout the country. Government officials and rescue organization leaders sought her input on everything from equipment standards to volunteer recruitment strategies. Margaret found this advisory role deeply satisfying, perhaps even more so than her active rescue work had been. She could share knowledge that had taken decades to acquire, helping to improve the effectiveness and safety of rescue operations across Scotland and beyond. The recognition from the King had given her a platform to influence the future of emergency services in ways that would benefit thousands of future victims and rescue workers. The preparation for the Windsor Castle ceremony intensified as the date approached. Margaret worked with palace officials to plan every detail of the event, from the guest list to the specific wording of the citation that would accompany her medal. She insisted that the ceremony acknowledge not just her individual service, but the contributions of all civilian rescue workers and the importance of supporting volunteer emergency services. The guest list for the ceremony reflected Margaret's priorities and values. In addition to her family members, she invited representatives from every mountain rescue team in Scotland, several people she had rescued over the years, and officials from organizations that supported civilian emergency services. She wanted the ceremony to celebrate the entire community of people who dedicated themselves to helping others, not just her individual achievements. Margaret also used the preparation period to establish a foundation that would support training and equipment purchases for volunteer rescue services. The media attention surrounding her recognition had generated significant public interest in supporting these organizations, and Margaret wanted to ensure that interest translated into concrete help for rescue teams that often struggled with limited resources. The foundation, called the Civilian Heroes Support Trust, would provide grants for rescue equipment, training programs, and safety initiatives for volunteer emergency services throughout the United Kingdom. Margaret planned to serve as the foundation's first chairwoman, using her newfound public profile to raise awareness and funding for causes that had been close to her heart throughout her career. As the ceremony date approached, Margaret reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that phone call from Buckingham Palace. She had gone from being an invisible guardian, known only to her immediate colleagues and the people she had rescued, to being a national symbol of civilian service and heroism. The transformation had been challenging and sometimes overwhelming, but it had also provided her with opportunities to influence and improve the future of rescue services in ways she had never imagined possible. The phone calls and letters from other rescue workers had been particularly meaningful to Margaret. Volunteers from all over the country had reached out to express their appreciation for her bringing attention to their work, and many had shared their own stories of dedication and service. These communications helped Margaret understand that her recognition was about more than her individual achievements. It was about acknowledging the value of all the people who chose to dedicate themselves to helping others. The week before the ceremony, Margaret received a personal letter from King Charles, thanking her for her gracious acceptance of the honor and expressing his hope that her recognition would inspire others to consider how they might contribute to their communities. The king also mentioned his intention to make civilian hero recognition a regular part of the honor system, ensuring that future volunteers would not wait decades for acknowledgement of their service. As Margaret prepared for the ceremony that would formally recognize her 4 decades of service, she felt a sense of completion and anticipation that she had never experienced before. The invisible guardian was about to become permanently visible, not just as an individual hero, but as a representative of all the people who chose service over recognition, dedication over comfort, and courage over safety. The ceremony would mark not just the end of her anonymity, but the beginning of a new chapter in which her experience and wisdom could benefit future generations of people dedicated to helping others. The transformation was complete. Margaret Thompson, the woman who had spent 40 years saving lives in the mountains while remaining invisible to official recognition systems, was about to become Margaret Thompson, the nationally recognized symbol of civilian heroism and public service. The ceremony at Windsor Castle would be the public acknowledgement of what she had always been, but it would also mark the beginning of what she could become. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect English spring weather that seemed to have been ordered specifically for the occasion. Margaret stood at the window of her hotel room in Windsor, looking out at the ancient castle that would serve as the backdrop for the most important day of her life. After weeks of preparation and anticipation, the moment had finally arrived when her 4 decades of service would be formally recognized at the highest levels of society. The preparation for the day had begun at dawn, with Margaret's daughter Sarah helping her dress in the formal outfit that had been selected for the occasion. They had chosen an elegant navy suit with subtle silver accents, complemented by a brooch that had belonged to Margaret's mother, and shoes comfortable enough to allow her to walk confidently through the formal ceremony. Every detail had been carefully considered to ensure that Margaret felt both appropriate for the royal setting and true to her own practical nature. Sarah was more nervous than her mother, fussing over details and constantly checking the schedule that had been provided by the palace. Margaret, by contrast, seemed surprisingly calm, drawing on the same inner steadiness that had served her well during countless emergency situations in the mountains. She had faced life and death decisions in extreme weather conditions, and she approached this ceremony with the same methodical preparation and quiet confidence that had characterized her rescue work. The car that arrived to transport them to Windsor Castle was understated but elegant, driven by a uniformed chauffeur who treated Margaret with the kind of respectful deference usually reserved for heads of state. The journey through Windsor Great Park provided Margaret with time to collect her thoughts and prepare mentally for the ceremony that would forever change how she was perceived by the public. The first glimpse of Windsor Castle in full ceremonial array was breathtaking. Flags flew from every tower, guards stood at attention in their magnificent uniforms, and the entire complex seemed to radiate the kind of historical importance that had accumulated over nearly 1,000 years of royal history. Margaret felt the weight of that history as they approached the entrance where she would be formally received. The reception inside the castle was managed with the precision and attention to detail that characterized all royal ceremonies. Margaret was greeted by senior members of the royal household staff, who had clearly been briefed extensively about her background and service record. They treated her not as a curiosity or an outsider, but as an honored guest whose presence was both expected and valued. The other guests for the ceremony had been arriving throughout the morning, and Margaret was moved to see how many people had made the journey to Windsor to witness her recognition. Representatives from mountain rescue teams throughout Scotland had traveled south for the occasion, many wearing their rescue service dress uniforms. Local officials from her home region were present, along with several families that Margaret had helped during emergency situations over the years. Perhaps most meaningful to Margaret was the presence of her fellow rescue volunteers, the men and women who had worked alongside her during countless operations and who understood better than anyone the significance of what she had accomplished. These were people who had seen her in action during the most challenging and dangerous situations, and their presence at the ceremony felt like validation from the people whose opinions mattered most to her. The ceremony itself was scheduled to take place in St. George's Hall, the magnificent medieval chamber that had hosted royal events for centuries. As guests were escorted into the hall, Margaret was taken to a private waiting room where she could compose herself before the formal proceedings began. The waiting room was decorated with portraits of previous recipients of royal honors, and Margaret found herself studying the faces of military heroes, public servants, and civilian leaders who had been recognized for their contributions to society. King Charles arrived at the castle precisely on schedule, and Margaret could hear the ceremonial music and formal announcements that accompanied his entrance to the hall. The sound of hundreds of people rising to their feet in unison created a low rumble that penetrated even the soundproofed walls of the waiting room. Margaret knew that in just a few minutes, she would be walking into that hall to receive recognition that would permanently alter how her service was remembered and understood. The formal procession into St. George's Hall was managed with military precision, but the atmosphere was warm and celebratory rather than intimidating. Margaret walked between two ceremonial guards, following a path that had been marked with red carpet, and flanked by guests who applauded as she passed. The hall itself was even more magnificent than she had imagined, with soaring Gothic arches, stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns across the stone floor, and heraldic banners representing centuries of British history. King Charles stood at the front of the hall, wearing the formal uniform of Admiral of the Fleet and displaying the kind of natural dignity that came from a lifetime of public service. When Margaret reached the designated position in front of the throne, she executed the curtsy that she had practiced dozens of times in the preceding weeks, grateful that her experience with technical rope work had given her excellent balance and body control. The citation that was read before the presentation of the medal captured the essence of Margaret's service in language that was both formal and deeply personal. It acknowledged her 437 successful rescue missions, her leadership of mountain rescue operations for over 2 decades, and her role in training hundreds of volunteer rescue workers. But it also recognized the less quantifiable aspects of her service, the dedication, courage, and selflessness that had motivated her to repeatedly risk her own safety for the benefit of strangers. When King Charles stepped forward to present the Royal Medal for Exceptional Civilian Service, he spoke directly to Margaret in words that were clearly personal rather than ceremonial. He thanked her for her service to the nation, acknowledged the sacrifices she had made throughout her career, and expressed his hope that her recognition would inspire others to consider how they might contribute to their communities. The medal itself was beautiful in its simplicity, designed to reflect the practical nature of civilian service while maintaining the dignity appropriate for royal recognition. The moment when the medal was placed around Margaret's neck was captured by photographers and videographers, but for Margaret herself, the experience was surprisingly intimate and personal despite the formal setting. King Charles took time to speak with her about her future plans, expressing particular interest in her foundation work and her role in developing training standards for rescue services. Their conversation, though brief, demonstrated the genuine respect and interest that had motivated the king to create this new category of recognition. The reception that followed the formal ceremony provided Margaret with the opportunity to reconnect with colleagues, meet with media representatives, and share her thoughts about the significance of the recognition. She was particularly moved by conversations with young rescue volunteers who expressed their pride in her achievement and their renewed commitment to their own service. The ceremony had clearly served its intended purpose of highlighting the value of civilian service and encouraging others to consider how they might contribute to their communities. The media coverage of the ceremony was extensive and overwhelmingly positive. Television news programs throughout the United Kingdom led with footage of the medal presentation, and newspapers the following day carried front-page photographs of Margaret with King Charles. Editorial writers praised both the creation of the new recognition category and the selection of Margaret as its first recipient, noting that her story highlighted the important contributions made by thousands of volunteers who typically received little public acknowledgement for their service. International media also picked up the story, with news organizations around the world reporting on the ceremony as an example of how societies can better recognize and support civilian heroes. The coverage sparked discussions in other countries about their own systems for acknowledging volunteer service, and several governments announced plans to review their recognition programs to ensure that civilian contributions were appropriately honored. For Margaret, the most meaningful aspect of the media coverage was the way it highlighted the broader community of people who dedicated themselves to helping others. Interviews with her fellow rescue workers, profiles of other volunteer organizations, and discussions of the challenges facing civilian emergency services all contributed to a national conversation about the value of public service and the importance of supporting the people who choose to serve their communities. The days immediately following the ceremony were filled with congratulatory messages from around the world, invitations to speak at events and conferences, and requests from Margaret to serve on committees and advisory boards related to emergency services and volunteer recognition. The flood of opportunities was overwhelming, but it also demonstrated the genuine impact that her recognition had achieved in raising awareness about civilian service. Margaret's daughter Sarah played a crucial role in helping her mother manage the response to the ceremony and the opportunities that followed. Together, they developed a strategy that would allow Margaret to accept the most meaningful invitations while maintaining her commitment to her foundation work and her ongoing involvement in rescue service training. They also established boundaries that would protect Margaret's privacy and ensure that she could continue to live a relatively normal life despite her new public profile. One of the most significant developments following the ceremony was the establishment of an annual awards program that would recognize outstanding civilian heroes throughout the United Kingdom. Margaret was invited to serve on the selection committee for these awards, ensuring that future recipients will be chosen based on the same criteria of service, dedication, and impact that had characterized her own career. The program would prevent other deserving individuals from waiting decades for recognition while creating a systematic way to celebrate civilian contributions to society. The ceremony at Windsor Castle had achieved everything that King Charles had hoped when he decided to create the new recognition category. Margaret's story had captured public attention, inspired discussions about the value of volunteer service, and established a precedent for recognizing civilian heroes who might otherwise remain invisible to official recognition systems. More importantly, it had demonstrated that society valued and appreciated the contributions of people who chose to dedicate themselves to helping others. As Margaret returned to Scotland following the ceremony, she carried with her not just a medal and a new public profile, but a renewed sense of purpose and possibility. The recognition from the king had validated her 4 decades of service, while opening new opportunities for her to influence the future of rescue services and civilian heroism. The invisible guardian had become permanently visible, but more importantly, she had become a symbol of the value that society placed on selfless service to others. The transformation was complete, but in many ways, Margaret's most important work was just beginning. Armed with royal recognition and a national platform, she was positioned to ensure that future generations of civilian heroes would receive the support, training, and acknowledgement they deserved. The ceremony at Windsor Castle had been the culmination of her individual service, but it was also the beginning of her legacy as an advocate for all the people who choose courage over comfort and service over recognition. 6 months after the ceremony at Windsor Castle, Margaret Thompson's life had settled into a new rhythm that balanced her traditional rescue work with her expanding role as a national advocate for civilian heroism. The cottage that had once been a quiet retreat between emergency calls had become the headquarters of a movement that was transforming how society recognized and supported volunteer service throughout the United Kingdom. The Civilian Heroes Support Trust that Margaret had established was exceeding all expectations for impact and growth. Donations had poured in from across the country, with contributions ranging from small amounts sent by individuals inspired by Margaret's story to substantial grants from corporate foundations and government agencies. The trust had already distributed over £2 million in grants to volunteer rescue organizations, funding everything from advanced rescue equipment to comprehensive training programs. Margaret spent her mornings working on trust business from her home office, reviewing grant applications, developing funding criteria, and coordinating with rescue organizations throughout the country. The work required skills that differed significantly from mountain rescue operations, but Margaret found that the same attention to detail, systematic thinking, and commitment to helping others that had made her an effective rescue coordinator served her well in her new administrative role. The afternoons were often devoted to travel, as Margaret accepted speaking engagements at conferences, training sessions, and public events throughout the United Kingdom and beyond. Her presentations focused on the technical aspects of rescue work, the importance of volunteer service, and the need for systematic support for civilian emergency responders. She had developed into a compelling public speaker, combining her practical experience with genuine passion for improving rescue services. The international response to Margaret's recognition had been particularly gratifying and had opened opportunities for collaboration with rescue services around the world. Organizations from Canada, New Zealand, Norway, and other countries with challenging mountain terrain had invited her to consult on training programs, safety protocols, and volunteer recruitment strategies. These international connections were helping to establish global standards for civilian rescue operations while spreading awareness of best practices developed in the Scottish mountains. The annual awards program that had been established following Margaret's ceremony was approaching its first presentation event. Over 300 nominations had been received for the inaugural Royal Medals for Exceptional Civilian Service, representing volunteers from every region of the United Kingdom and every type of emergency service imaginable. Margaret served on the selection committee alongside representatives from government, emergency services, and volunteer organizations, ensuring that recipients were chosen based on merit rather than publicity or political considerations. The challenge of selecting winners from such a large pool of deserving candidates had reminded Margaret of how many extraordinary people were working quietly in communities throughout the country. The nomination letters told stories of teachers who had dedicated decades to helping disadvantaged children, nurses who had volunteered their time in disaster zones, community organizers who had transformed troubled neighborhoods, and countless other individuals whose service had made profound differences in the lives of others. Margaret's role in the selection process had also given her insights into the systematic problems that prevented many civilian heroes from receiving recognition they deserved. The nomination process revealed gaps in how volunteer organizations documented and reported the contributions of their members, inconsistencies in how different types of service were valued, and persistent bias toward recognizing uniformed services over civilian contributions. These insights had led Margaret to expand her advocacy work beyond rescue services to address broader issues of volunteer recognition and support. She had begun working with government officials, nonprofit leaders, and community organizers to develop policies and programs that would systematically identify and acknowledge civilian service. The goal was to create systems that would prevent future heroes from remaining invisible for decades, as she had been. The media attention that continued to surround Margaret's work had evolved from human interest stories about her personal recognition to substantive coverage of policy issues related to volunteer services. News programs regularly featured segments about rescue operations, community service projects, and volunteer recognition programs, often using Margaret's story as a starting point for broader discussions about civic engagement and public service. Margaret had also begun collaborating with academic researchers who were studying the social and economic impact of volunteer services. Her practical experience, combined with systematic research, was producing evidence that could be used to advocate for increased government support for civilian emergency services. The research was demonstrating that volunteer rescue operations save taxpayers millions of pounds annually while providing services that would be impossible to deliver through traditional government agencies. The personal impact of her recognition had been equally significant, though more subtle than the public changes in her life. Margaret's relationship with her daughter Sarah had grown stronger as they worked together to manage the opportunities and responsibilities that had followed the royal ceremony. Sarah had taken a leave of absence from her teaching position to help with the foundation work, discovering that she had both aptitude and passion for nonprofit management. Margaret's grandchildren, who were now 10 and 14 years old, had begun to understand and appreciate their grandmother's work in ways that had not been possible when she was simply another volunteer rescue worker. They had attended the ceremony at Windsor Castle, met King Charles personally, and gained a new appreciation for the importance of helping others. The recognition had given them a role model for civic engagement that would influence their own choices about how to contribute to society. The relationship with King Charles had continued to develop beyond the formal recognition ceremony. Margaret had been invited to several private consultations about civilian service recognition, and she had found the king to be genuinely committed to ensuring that volunteer contributions were properly valued and supported. Their conversations had influenced Royal Foundation funding priorities and had led to new initiatives designed to strengthen volunteer organizations throughout the Commonwealth. The impact of Margaret's recognition on the rescue service community had been profound and lasting. Recruitment for volunteer rescue organizations had increased significantly throughout the country, with many new volunteers citing Margaret's story as inspiration for their own service. Training programs were reporting higher completion rates and greater enthusiasm among participants who now understood that their work was valued at the highest levels of society. Equipment manufacturers had also responded to the increased attention on rescue services by developing new products specifically designed for volunteer operations. The combination of increased funding through Margaret's Foundation and improved equipment availability was enabling rescue teams to operate more safely and effectively than ever before. Insurance companies had begun offering better coverage for volunteer rescue workers, reducing the personal financial risks associated with service. Margaret continued to participate in actual rescue operations, though less frequently than in previous decades. When she did respond to emergency calls, the experience was different from her previous anonymous service. Other volunteers and emergency personnel treated her with a level of respect and deference that sometimes made coordination more difficult, but she had learned to manage these dynamics while maintaining the effectiveness of rescue operations. The most challenging aspect of her new public profile was the constant request for media interviews, speaking engagements, and personal appearances. Margaret had learned to be selective about these opportunities, focusing on events that would advance her advocacy goals while declining invitations that seemed designed primarily to capitalize on her celebrity status. The balance between public service and personal privacy required constant attention and careful decision-making. The foundation work had introduced Margaret to policymakers and government officials who were working to address broader issues related to emergency services, public safety, and volunteer management. Her practical experience had proven valuable in these discussions, providing real-world perspective on policy proposals that might otherwise be developed without adequate understanding of operational realities. Margaret's influence on government policy had led to increased funding for volunteer rescue services, improved coordination between civilian and professional emergency responders, and new legislation protecting volunteers from liability issues that had previously discouraged participation in rescue operations. These policy changes would benefit thousands of current and future volunteers while improving the overall effectiveness of emergency response systems. As the first anniversary of her recognition approached, Margaret reflected on how completely her life had changed since that phone call from Buckingham Palace. She had evolved from an invisible guardian, known only to her immediate colleagues and the people she had rescued, to a national figure whose work was influencing policy, inspiring volunteers, and improving emergency services throughout the country and beyond. The transformation had not always been comfortable, and Margaret sometimes missed the simplicity of her previous anonymous service. But she had come to understand that her recognition represented something larger than her individual achievements. It was acknowledgement of the value that society placed on selfless service and commitment to helping others. Her visibility had created opportunities to improve conditions for all volunteer rescue workers and to ensure that future civilian heroes would not remain invisible as she had for so many decades. The legacy that was taking shape extended far beyond Margaret's individual service record. The foundation she had established would continue supporting rescue organizations long after her direct involvement ended. The policy changes she had influenced would provide systematic support for volunteer services for generations. The recognition program she had helped develop would ensure that other deserving individuals received timely acknowledgement for their contributions. Perhaps most importantly, Margaret's story had changed how society thought about heroism and service. The traditional focus on military and uniformed service had expanded to include recognition of civilian contributions, creating a more inclusive understanding of what it meant to serve one's community. Young people throughout the country were making different choices about how to spend their time and energy, inspired by an example of service that proved ordinary individuals could make extraordinary contributions to society. As Margaret looked toward the future, she saw opportunities to continue expanding the impact of civilian service recognition while gradually stepping back from the intense public attention that had characterized the year following her ceremony. She planned to continue her foundation work, her policy advocacy, and her training activities, but she also hoped to return to a somewhat quieter life that would allow her to enjoy her grandchildren and pursue personal interests that had been set aside during her years of intensive rescue work. The Invisible Guardian had become a visible symbol of civilian heroism, but more importantly, she had become the architect of systems that would support and recognize future generations of people who chose service over recognition, courage over comfort, and dedication over convenience. Her legacy would be measured not just in the lives she had saved during her decades of rescue work, but in a life that would be saved by the improved systems, better training, and enhanced support that her recognition had made possible. The story that had begun with a phone call from the palace had become a transformation of how society valued and supported the ordinary people who made extraordinary contributions to their communities. Margaret Thompson's recognition had been the beginning, not the end, of a movement that would ensure civilian heroes were never again overlooked or forgotten.